Participants, I think can mute yourself. That will be good. Anyway, I think that's fine. Let us give an overview of the machine learning algorithm. So anybody just confirm if you can see the slides. Yeah, I hope you
Yes,
can
sir.
see the slide. Yeah, thank you.
Visible, sir.
Yeah, thank you. So I will continue. All right. So machine learning basically talks about algorithm or systems that improve their performance with experience and generalize to unseen input. So this is different from a normal program. That normal program, once you write it, it does not change. It will give you the same performance whatever input you get. But the good thing about machine learning algorithm is that as the algorithm gets used, as it runs on more and more data, it can use the information in the data to improve the performance of the system. It will improve the performance of the system. And not only that, even on inputs which are previously unseen, which you have not seen before, you can still generalize, you can give some good output for that system also. So generally, this type of system, machine learning system, will be used in environments which we don't know fully. We don't know exactly how things work. There is a lot of uncertainty, either because it is too complex or we cannot measure all the variables. For some reason, we do not have full knowledge of the system. If we had full knowledge, maybe we could have written a deterministic program and solved it, but we don't have full knowledge. Another thing is that any system which is changing with time, it is evolving. Naturally, you don't know what will happen in future. So you have to have some form of generalization. And finally, like it maybe your system may be performing in a completely unknown environment. Completely unknown environment. You might think a little bit that these properties are actually what human beings, when they learn, they follow. So we do not write down a rule book for each and every situation that we encounter in a life. We learn from previous experiences and generalize to these new and unseen inputs. Okay, we generalize to that. So that is what is a capability of human system. So machine learning algorithms try to mimic that capability in a computer system. As I have said before, it is usually useful in situations where we don't have complete knowledge. For example, say recognizing a face. Nobody can clearly write down how somebody's face will look like. Nobody can give a proper description. You only look at it and feel it. Email spam, it is very difficult what will be a spam. You don't know beforehand. Say rainfall forecasting, we don't know beforehand. So these are the problems where, as opposed to traditional algorithms, machine learning algorithms give a much better performance. And these type of problems are many in biology. These type of problems are all problems in computational biology falls in this category. We don't have complete knowledge of any biological system, and systems change with time. We don't have all the measurements available to us, and new situations may evolve. We have to generalize to it. Okay, so all these situations are there, and that's why in many biological problems, even very lab work and other thing, machine learning in some form of other, in some form of computer package or other, this has become, unavoidable. You have to work with machine learning system. Okay, so the goal of today's talk is to kind of give an overview of the machine learning algorithms that are available. I'll try to keep things simple so that you can understand. One more thing about machine learning is that it is a inductive rather than deductive. So deductive reasoning means it is reasoning by logic. For example, the kind of reasoning that you follow when you prove a theorem in geometry. You start on some general axioms, and then apply logic that this follows from this follows from this, and then you prove the thing. So you have a general set of rules. From that you apply logically and come to a conclusion for a particular case. Whereas inductive inferencing and inductive reasoning is the other way. So first you are in the deductive reasoning, first the rules are given. From that you apply to a particular instance. Here the instances are given. From there you try to derive a rule. So you are given certain examples of this happens, this, like you teach to a child, this is a cow, this is a dog, this is a cat. And from that you will come up with a rule that, okay, if something has 4 legs and a tail, then maybe it is a cow, and it will come to such general rules. So these rules, we will call them as model, and these instances or examples we will call as data. So inductive inference is rather you will be given the data and you have to come up with the model. You have to come up with the model of the data. Okay, so this is very common in biology. For example, it is always data driven. There are very few general models which works everywhere in biology. Okay, of course there are many, but there are many for which there are no models available. So what we actually do, you do experiments, you do laboratory experiments, you do clinical studies, and from all these data, you try to come up with a hypothesis. You try to come up with a law, you try to come up with a model and say that in future, okay, this model I have hypothesized from lot of data, and in future I'll use this, keep on using this model for the unseen examples. So that is what is the goal here. So in summary, like say for example, I have a lot of microarray experiments and I want to find out that these are the, I want to form a model that these genes, if they are active, then this thing happens. So I do not have a rule. Nobody has given me a rule. Rather, what I will do is that I will do a lot of microarray assaying. I will, for patients and not patients, I will do assaying, and from analyzing this data, I will come up with such a model or a rule. Often these rules may be probabilistic, like they may not say with 100% certainty, but they may say that, okay, this is a high probability that this will happen. Okay, so that's why this inductive inference is very important. So let us see. So what is our goal? We'll be given a set of data and we have to kind of fit a model to it so that the model can be used in future also for unknown examples also. So that so this, if we draw a block diagram, this will be how you will be doing it. So let us explain this picture. The central thing is this learning model. The box I have shown in the middle. This is the learning model. Okay. So and what is a learning model? To its input, there is some set of values. Let's call it X. Some set of values. This can be microarray activation levels. This can be sequences in a gene. This can be metabolism, different activity levels of different metabolic products. This can be anything. So the input will be a set of values. Since it is a set of values, we can think of it as a vector of values. Let us call that vector as X. Okay. So this is the first step. That means whenever you have some objects, say a microarray or a gene or a protein or whatever you want, you have to represent it as a vector of values. It may be real values, it may be discrete values, it may be continuous values, whatever it is, you have to represent it as a vector. This vector is called the feature vector of the object. It is like a set of measurements about object, that we call it as a feature vector or a feature representation. This is the first step. This is whenever you try to apply machine learning to a problem, the first step you should do is to represent an object as a feature vector. You can take several examples. For example, face recognition. If you take an image of a face, all the pixel values of the image, they will be by vector representation. If you take a speech, all the audio signal, that if you say the frequencies of the audio signal, that is a vector, that is your feature vector. You take a gene sequence, okay, maybe how many times each of the amino acids appear, those measurement, that can be a vector. It can be anything. Protein sequence, there were several parameters of the protein, hydrophobicity and such things. If you put them, collect them all together as a vector, that is a vector representation. Okay, so what the learning model does is takes as input a vector representation of an object and comes up with some inference or comes up with some output. For example, if you have a microarray as a vector representation and whether some disease is there, somebody has some disease or not, the output can be either that disease is there or not, yes or no. Output can be this. So usually we denote the input by X and the output by Y. Or say it is a protein, some parameters of a protein, and the output may be what type of tertiary structure it will have, alpha helix or what type of tertiary structure it will have. That may be the output that we want to predict. Note that this is a complex structure. That means just given some measurements of the protein without doing a lot of calculation, just from the data you are trying to predict what kind of tertiary structure it will have. So it's a complicated thing. It's not a very simple thing. So you can think of this learning model as some kind of mathematical function fx, which takes as input x and produces an output y. It takes as input x, produces an output y. Okay. So now one more thing. So that it is basically, this learning model is basically a mathematical function fx. Maybe it is a little more complicated. Instead of directly saying y, maybe it can say y with this much probability, like this. Okay. So now you have some model and you are trying to predict the output y. It may happen that your prediction do not match the actual output. So some protein you are predicted to be alpha helix, it is not actually alpha helix. In experiment says it is not alpha helix. So there might be an error between this y and fx. There might be an error between them. And in usually machine learning system, we have some kind of error function to measure this error. How much difference is this between actual output and predicted output? How much difference? You have a error function. And this error is given as a feedback. It is given as a feedback to the learning model. And what the learning model does is that based on that feedback, it changes the model. So you have certain model for certain mathematical function for predicting, say, a protein structure, and you find that it is giving wrong result. So you change your model. Change your model. Usually what we'll do is that you will keep the structure of the function, this mathematical function same, but we will change the parameters of the function. We'll change the parameters of the function. We'll update the parameters of the function depending on error is, and we will keep on doing so till the error goes down to very small value. Till the error reduces to a very small value, we will keep on updating the parameters. Okay. All right. So I think one more thing to be told in this process is that, see, we are comparing fx with some reference y, which is actual value of y, and then finding the error. So there should be a set of examples where x and the corresponding actual value of y is provided to us. That this, if this is x, this should be y. So you should be given a set of proteins with their parameters whose structure is known. Which structure is already known by experiment or somehow. So given an input, what the actual output should be, that should be given for certain number of instances, because only then I can calculate the error function. Otherwise, I cannot calculate the error function. So this set of examples on which the target output, the actual output, desired output is given is called the training data. So you use this training data to update your parameters. See, it is like what when we go to school we do. We are given some examples by the teachers. We are asked to solve the examples. And if the solution is wrong, if your predicted output is wrong, there is an error, the teacher will ask you to change your solution process. It will ask you to change, it will change your parameters. So you keep on doing, you keep on learning. So that's what is called learning. This parameter update is what is called learning. It is changing the function. If we keep on doing it, so that for all the given examples to you for solution, your error is very low, 90% marks or whatever marks you have got, 90% of the problems you have solved correctly. Then you stop. You say you are ready. Now your learning is over. Now you can go out and apply your learning to other examples. Your learning is over. You have got a sufficiently low error. Okay, so this training data is also to be given. So the only thing about this process is that in human beings, maybe the number of solutions, number of parameters you can propose, or the number of times you can make a parameter update is limited. But in computers, you can make millions of such parameter, millions of times you can repeat this. Millions of times you can repeat this. Till you get the correct model. Till you get the correct model, millions of times you can repeat this. So that's what the benefit of using a computer. And finally you get it. So basically you can get a, even if you have a very bad effects in the beginning, if you do it million number of times, maybe you will come up with a good effects. So that's the advantage. Okay. Now let us see what this output Y can be. What type of outputs we usually think about. Okay, so one of the possible problems that we solve, like this problem, this if given some parameters of a protein, you want to predict what the tertiary structure would be. So these there are only finite, so few possible tertiary structures, alpha helix, beta coil, few type of structures are there, few type of. So each of the structures we call it as a class or a category, and it is predefined that these are the classes possible, or these are the categories possible. For example, if you are trying to categorize a microarray data into what disease the patient has, it is a set of diseases, set of classes, set of categories, and the goal is to, so in that case, the goal is to, given an input object, basically put it in one of the categories. Say what type of tertiary structure it is, put it in one of the categories. So you see, in this case, since it is a number of defined categories, the output Y can be thought of as some discrete value, finite number of values. We can as well call them as class 1, class 2, class 3, and so on. Maybe class 1 represents alpha helix, class 2 represents some other structure like that. You can say that. So the output is a integer representing the class number, where each class represents some category. Such problems, so there are many more examples. For example, as email, there are two categories, class 1, class 2, spam or not spam. Object recognition, maybe there are 1,000 categories, cat or a dog or something. So this type of problems are called classification problems. These are called classification problems. Okay. So of course, here we say the output is an integer 1, 2, 3. The next possibility is, okay, it's not an integer, it's a continuous value, some floating point number, some continuous value, some real number. So if the output is a real number, we call it as a regression problem. Call it as a regression problem. Okay. So there are many regression. For example, in a metabolic network, I want to predict how much this gene will be expressed. some relative value, how much this is. So that's a continuous value between, let's say, if it is normalized between 0 and 1. So it's a continuous value. Okay, it's not a class, it's a continuous value. So such problems are called regression problems. Finally, there is another class of problem where really the output is again a set of classes, but the classes are not predefined. It can be anything. So protein structure, for example, the classes are predefined. This is one category of protein structure, this is another category of tertiary structure, and so on. But suppose it is not defined. It is not defined. You are exploring, your goal is to find out a set of examples which are related to each other, which belong to a same group, and to group objects. Doesn't matter so it is similar to classification, but classification, it is one of the known categories, whereas in clustering there is no given category to you, but rather you have to form groups, homogeneous groups. So this again, usually in exploratory analysis you do it. Say for example, motifs, you are doing a clustering the motif. What set of motifs are similar? What are the groups of motifs? So such problems will be known as clustering problems. Also, depending on what is the nature, so this is a categorization of machine learning algorithm based on what type of output, what is the prediction task you are getting. Next, let us categorize the machine learning algorithm based on what type of training data, what type of examples the teacher is giving to you. What type of example teacher is giving to you. Here again, there are two major types. One is supervised. That means teacher gives you a practice problem and also gives you the solution of the practice problem. So for each input of the training data, the actual output, what actual output should be, that is also alongside given to you. So a practice problem is given, and along with that, the solution of the practice problem is also given to you, so that you can tune yourself so that your solution matches with the actual solution. Your solution matches with the actual solution. Such a framework is called a supervised learning framework. Supervised learning framework. Okay. It is like when you are, say, learning to drive a car and you have a driving instructor sitting beside you. He will always tell you that, okay, now do this. Now you should put the brake. Now you should turn left. So he will tell you all this. So this is supervision. So these are also sometimes called predictive data analysis. And if the teacher does not tell you what the output will be, output is not, the solution is not given to you, just the problem is given to you, then it is called unsupervised or exploratory data analysis, or unsupervised learning, unsupervised training set. Here, no output is given to you, no desired output is given to you. Okay, but what you have to do then, what you will do in, you try to find a solution which will satisfy some property. Maybe all the similar examples should be grouped together, or some natural pattern in the data should be found out. Okay, so you try to get a solution which satisfies. Maybe you try to get a small few step solution. So this is unsupervised. Explicitly, the desired output is not given, but rather some desired properties of the solution is given to you. Like a group of homogeneous objects should be close together. Okay, sometimes in real life, we have a mixture of these two. So for some of the examples that the teacher gives you in the training set, you have the desired output, but for most of them, you do not have the desired output. By the way, this desired output, several names from it. These are sometimes called history, sometimes ground truth, sometimes annotation, sometimes labels. By different name, this output Y is called. Okay, any question, anybody? I can answer. Or maybe participants can mute their mics if they are not asking any question. Okay, so maybe somebody has forgotten to. Yeah, I think I've got it. Okay. So often we have a semi-supervised setting. So these are the settings. Okay. So I have classified the machine learning algorithm based on what type of output you have, what type of training data we have. Now, based on what type of this function effects you have, what are the possible function effects you have. So what we do usually, as I have said, the actual function depends on the parameter values of the function. Say you have a straight line ax plus by plus c. Its family is a straight line, but which straight line depends on the value of a, b, and c. So if the straight line ax plus by plus c equal to 0. Okay, so this a, b, c will be called the parameters of the model. We'll keep on changing the parameters to change the line. Whereas this class of all lines, this is called a function class. So depending on what function class this fx belongs to, of course, the function class will also depend on what your output is. It is a categorical discrete output or continuous output. The function class will depend on that. But depending on this function class, we have different type of machine learning models. Depending on this one, if it is linear, we have a linear model. If it is quadratic, we have a quadratic model. If it is very complicated nonlinear, we call it a neural network, and so on. So we have different type of learning models. Okay, so I have listed below some of the learning models like logistic regression, Bayesian learning, k-nearest neighbor, decision tree, support vector machine, boosting, random forest, neural networks, and for clustering you have k-means, hierarchical clustering, DB-scan. There are many. There are thousands of function classes or machine learning models that exist. Okay. So to explain this concept, what this parameter tuning is and what this model means, we'll take a simple example. So let's say we have only one variable. Let's say we are measuring the length of some species. We are trying to, or not species. Say suppose we are measuring the length of a species. Length of a species we are trying to measure. That's the x-axis. That's what we have measured. There's the input. It's not a vector. It's a single dimensional vector. Input is just x. And the output y, let's say it's a regression problem. That means it is a real value. Let's say I want to predict the weight of that particular sample of species. I want to measure the height and I want to measure the weight. For example, if the species is a human being, I want to measure the height of a person, not the length, the height of a person, and predict what is the weight of that person. And see, these curves are important because the BMI, the basal metabolic index, all those things will depend on what is the slope of this line. Are you above this slope or below this slope? So you are overweight or underweight. All this will come. So, so let us try to. So what I have done, these red points, these are actually a set of measurements of length or height and weight of several human species examples that we have noted down. And we want to find out what is the average relation between height and weight of human beings. So basically, this is a regression problem. What I would like to do is I would like to express y, the weight, as a function of the input, that is height, and some parameter value, say slope of the line or something, which we call this at beta. And plus what will happen exactly, see, somebody's weight we cannot predict exact. 2% having same height will not have the same weight. So this uncertainty, we express it by a small random number we call epsilon, or a noise we call epsilon. Okay, so this is a typical machine learning model which we have all seen. It's a linear regression model. You have, everybody of you have encountered this. This is the simplest example possible of a machine learning model. If we want to make it even more simple, let's assume this function f, which relates x to y, is a line. is a line, is a straight line. It may not be a straight line, but let's assume it is a straight line. And now what are the parameters of the straight line? You have two parameters, the intercept beta naught and the slope beta 1 plus this epsilon. Okay. So what the machine learning algorithm will try to do, it will try to find, let us assume it is a line, it will try to find the best blue line which best fits all the data. What is the meaning of best fit? It has the, see, how do you predict? You pick up a x, look up the y-axis on this blue line. That will be your predicted value for that given x. For this given height, that will be the predicted weight. But an example which has the may not have exactly that predicted weight, so you have to measure an error between the predicted and the actual weight of that person who is having that height. How do you measure the error? You take the difference and square it up. Take the difference and square it up. And that value you accumulate, you add up for all these red points. You add up for all these red points and take the average. And you call that as the mean square error, mean squared error. Okay, so this is very common. I think I am just wasting your time by repeating this, but I think this is the simplest example to make the what is machine learning, to make that concept clear. I am taking this example. Okay, so now the next question would be that what is the value of beta naught and beta 1 such that this mean squared error is minimum among all possible lines, which is the best line. So you can see this is an optimization problem. You want to minimize the error with respect to beta naught and beta 1. This is an optimization problem. There are many ways you solve this optimization problem, taking the derivative to 0 and all this, you maxima, you know the derivative will be 0. So all this you solve the optimization problem and get the value of beta naught, beta 1, that will give you the line. In future, when you get a new point x, you can use this line to predict the weight of that person, provided you know the height of the person. Okay, so here it's very simple machine learning because this parameter update is equivalent to finding the optimal parameter beta naught, beta 1, which minimizes the error. And your training set is this set of red points, right? Okay, so let me now go to a little more complicated problem. Okay, so this is a regression problem. Let us now go to a classification problem. So regression problem is I have measured the length of a sample of species and I want to predict the weight. Weight is a real number. Now let's try to classify. Let's say what I will do is I'll measure the length of a species and I'll try to find out which species it belongs to. Okay, or which category it belongs to. Okay, so since there are finite number of categories available to me, this is a classification problem. Let us take a simple example. So let's say there are two species of fish. Okay, Hilsa and tuna. We measure the length of the fish, of a sample of fish, and decide whether that fish is belonging to this Hilsa class or tuna class, which class it belongs to. So it's a classification problem. We have kept some samples, only two classes are there. In general, there may be other classes of fish also. Let's say there are only two classes of fish, and all I want to do is I want to measure the length of a fish and decide which class it belongs to, just on the basis of the length. And that I can do because these two species, this is the left one is a Hilsa and the right one is a tuna. They do differ in length. They actually differ in the length. So I can use length to decide which class it is. Okay, so what I will do, what will be the first step of doing this? And so I want to discriminate between two classes based on the length. So let us see what is the kind of usual distribution of length of Hilsa and what is the distribution of length of tuna. Let us try to see that. How will you see that? you have to go to market and buy a lot of Hilsa fish, lot of samples of Hilsa fish, and measure, maybe you buy 1000 Hilsa, not buy, maybe measure the length of 1000 Hilsa fish, and similarly measure the length of 1000 tuna fish, and then that will give an idea that what is the kind of length distribution of Hilsa, length distribution of tuna, and once we get an idea about this distribution, we can use that information to decide after looking at the length of a particular sample, it is Hilsa or tuna. Okay, so after this 1000 measurement of each of the classes of fish, we do the following. We construct something called a histogram. We construct something called a histogram, which is something like this. So I have drawn two histograms, one for all the 1000 Hilsa fish and one for all the 1000 tuna fish that I have measured. So what I will do is the following. Along the x-axis, I will plot the length of the fish, and I will divide it into very small intervals. I'll divide it into very small intervals, say 1 inch to 2 inch, 2 inch to 3 inch, 3 inch to 4 inch, like this. I'll divide the interval. And out of these 1000 fish, I'll count how many have length between 1 and 2 inch. Okay, that's very impractical, but still I'm drawing it. 2 and 3 inch, 3 and 4 inch, maybe 1 foot and 1 feet 1 inch, 1 feet and 1 feet 2 inch, and so on. We'll count how many of the fish belong to this, and I'll plot that as my y-axis. I'll plot that as my y-axis, and I'll do this also for tuna. I'll plot that along the y-axis. In fact, instead of plotting the raw count, I can divide the count by 1000, the total number of samples that I have taken, so that the value will be between 0 and 1, and all these values will add up to 1. So it will be a probability distribution. It will be a probability distribution. Okay. So, and also if I make these intervals very, very small, they will start looking smoother and smoother. The histogram will become a distribution, a probability distribution. Okay. And I will get two distributions like this. And what type of probability these distributions mean? This blue distribution, it will mean that suppose I know that a fish is Hilsa, this distribution will give me what is the probability it has a particular length. So for example, if I ask the question that given that a fish is Hilsa, what is the probability its length is 1.75 feet? How do you do that? You go to the Hilsa distribution, along the x-axis, go to 1.75 feet, maybe somewhere here, go to y-axis, and that value will give you the probability. This value will give you the probability of this probability. Similarly, you can do for tuna. Okay. All right. So since these are conditional probabilities, that means given a class, what is its length is some value. These are called class conditional distributions or class conditional probabilities. These are called class conditional probabilities, right? Naturally, you see the class conditional distributions are different for each of the classes. They are different. The tuna is more biased towards larger length, whereas the Hilsa has a smaller length, mean value. But one thing also you notice, there are some tuna which is maybe 2 feet, and also some Hilsa which is also 2 feet. So these two distributions are overlapping. Any questions so far? You can ask me. Okay. All right. So now, based on these distributions, I want to form a simple decision rule. What is the rule? I will fix some boundary, some threshold length B, capital B, say 3 feet or 2.5 feet or 2 feet or whatever. I'll fix some length B, and I will say that any fish sample whose length is less than equal to this B, I'll call it as Hilsa. and otherwise I'll call it as tuna. Okay, so it's a very simple rule. All I will do is that I'll catch a fish, I'll measure its length, I'll compare the length with B. If it is less than B, I'll just tell it is Hilsa. Maybe it is a robotic system. So if it is a human, they will obviously recognize. So it is a robotic kind of system, and the robot will just measure, can only measure the length. It will measure the length, and it will compare with B. And if it is less than B, it will say it's Hilsa. Otherwise, it will say it is tuna. Okay. Okay. So the next question is, based on these histograms that you have, what is a good choice of B? What is a good choice of B? Note that this classifier, this machine learning system that we are talking about, has only one parameter, B. And the learning process is nothing but from these 2000 samples, 1000 samples, have to find a good value of B, so that the error in classification, or rather the misclassification, is minimum. Okay, misclassification is minimum. So if some fish is Hilsa, actually Hilsa, this rule should also tell it is Hilsa, and vice versa. Okay, so how to find a good value of B? Let us try to see. Let us place these two class conditional distributions side by side, and let's say just assume that, say, this is my B. This is my B, which is the boundary. Okay. Now, if this is my B, let's see what is the error I have committed. Okay, so what is the y-axis of this curve? As I have said before, it is the count or the probability that a fish has this length, a Hilsa fish has this length. This is the count or the probability. So let me draw it. Can anybody just try to see what is this area? So sum up all these heights, that is the area. What is this? This means that, okay, all these fish, since their length is less than B, the rule will say they are Hilsa. Remember the rule. Remember the rule. Okay. For all these fish, so many number of fish or so many probability of fish, the rule will say it is Hilsa. But if you look at this pink curve, they actually, so many fish actually are tuna. So this region is a type 1 error. That means actually the fish is tuna, or rather so many fish are tuna, or so many the probability that the fish are tuna, because it is from the pink curve, but the rule says it is Hilsa. Okay, rule say this is Hilsa. Okay, so this is definitely an error. It is actually tuna. I am calling it Hilsa. I call it as type 1 error, and this much amount type 1 error I will compute. So if the y-axis is count, so many fish will be misclassified. If the y-axis is probability, the probability that type 1 error will happen is this much. Similarly, I can do for type 2 error. I can do for type 2 error. Okay, so all these fish, they are actually the count that they are Hilsa, but this rule, because they are on the right side of B, the rule will say it is tuna. So this is type 2 error. Actually, the fish is Hilsa, whereas the rule says it is tuna. So type 1 plus type 2, these are only two error possible, is this much area. Is this much area. All right. So now if you change your position of B, you can easily check that if you change your position of B, suppose this is your new B, your error will change. So how much will be type 1 error now? This much. And type 2 error, this much. This much. So your error value will change. So error actually depends on where you place your B. So error is dependent on the parameter b. Okay, so now I ask you the question, where should I place my b so that I get the smallest possible error? Where should I place my b? Where I will get the smallest possible error? Just think a little bit where it should be. Which will give me the smallest possible error? Okay, I say that the smallest possible error will be when b is placed at this intersection. Let me call it as b star. When b is placed at this intersection, I have the smallest possible error. What is the amount of error? The amount of error is this much plus this much. Okay, this is the amount of error. You can easily figure out that any other place you place your b, the amount of error will be this error plus some extra error. For example, if b is here, this is the total error. This is the total error. It is this error plus some extra error. Anywhere else you see, same thing will happen. If you place here, the total error will be this much, which is this red part plus this part. Okay, so anywhere else you place your b, your error will be higher, and this b star at the intersection will have the smallest value of error, and that is the best choice of your boundary. That is the best choice of your boundary. Okay, so this is the best possible boundary. Okay, so now let's see what b star is. See, b star is where these two curves, these two conditional distribution, class conditional distributions, they intersect. That means at this b star, the y value given by the blue curve is same as the y value given by the tuna curve. So these two are the same. These two are the same. That's the intersection point. So all I'll do is to basically I will collect some samples. I'll draw these class conditional distributions. I'll find a b star where they intersect, and that I will use my optimal decision boundary. And in future, when I measure the length of a fish, I will compare it with this optimal decision boundary, and based on that decide this hills are tuna. Okay, so these are the set of steps. I'll measure the length, estimate the distribution, find out the optimal decision boundary at the intersection, and then apply the rule. And I have already seen that this is the best decision boundary. This will give you the minimum error possible. Okay, that's the summary. But there is one more factor. See, all your decision is based on these histograms, these class conditional distributions you have done. And the class conditional distributions in turn depends on the samples that you have got, 1000 Hilsa, 1000 tuna, on the samples that you have got, because this is how you have drawn them. So of course, this nature of this will depend on the 1000 samples that you have drawn. It will depend on that. Okay, so it's dependent on the samples. Now, these samples will depend on from which market you have bought the fishes. This will depend on which market you have done the fishes. So if you are bought 2000 fish from, let's say, Calcutta, almost all of them will be Hilsa, very few tuna will get if you randomly sample. Similarly, vice versa, if you do in California, you will get more tuna and less Hilsa. Okay, so if you are doing this experiment, let's say in Calcutta, even if you have a very big fish, say 2 feet fish, which should have been a tuna, but because it is Calcutta, there is a very low probability that this will be tuna, because there are no tuna in Calcutta. A very low probability. So this factor should be taken into account. So this factor is taken into account by something called a priori probability. That means a priori means before you make any measurement of the fish, you really haven't seen the fish yet blindly. You just only know you are in Calcutta, nothing else you know. Your eyes are closed. You have gone to the market with your eyes closed. You have not seen the fish yet, but you know you are in Calcutta. So, if what is the probability that it is Hilsa? Without opening your eyes, you can say maybe the probability is 0.9 that it is Hilsa, because you know you are in Calcutta. Okay. And similarly, if you are in California, even without opening your eyes, even if without looking at the fish, if somebody picks up a random fish, you are still your eyes are closed and asks you what this fish is, your answer will be tuna, because you know you are in California. There is no Hilsa in California. Okay, so this probability, which is independent of the length of the fish, just depends on where you have collected the samples from, is called the a priori probability. So this is one possible. Note that this should add up to 1. It should add up to 1. So this is the a priori probability. So what we say is that as alongside this class conditional, after looking at the length, you should also take into account this a priori. Let me give another example. Let's say a patient has gone to a doctor and you have measured some temperature of the patient or something. And after measuring the temperature, you want to classify whether influenza is there or malaria is there or COVID is there. Or maybe dengue. Okay, dengue is happening more now. Say malaria or COVID is there. So if it was 2017 or 18 or even 19, if somebody comes and says you have fever and you know you are in 2019, you could have closed your eyes and say that it's malaria. Or okay, malaria is not. Let's say it's influenza. You could have closed your eyes and say it is influenza without looking at the temperature. Somebody comes, doctor even doesn't bother to measure your temperature. She says that you have influenza. You take this medicine. In 2018, this will be the case. That's the a priori probability. For influenza is say 0.99, COVID is almost 0. But if you are doing this in 2020, you cannot say this. You cannot say this. Okay, it depends, because you know you are in 2020. Maybe you are 50-50, it's influenza or COVID. Okay, so let me silence. Some participant has unmuted. I'll just quickly. Okay. Okay, so this should also be a factor in determining the classification. So I have two factors. One is the class conditional probability, looking at the length. Another is this a priori probability. How do I combine these two? I just multiply them. Just a minute. I'll just multiply them. And I'll divide it by some constant. Let's forget about this constant. Okay, so I'll multiply the a priori into the class conditional. I'll multiply the a priori, which is P Hilsa, and class conditional given Hilsa. Okay, this product, if we divide by something called what is a irrespective of, I divide it by some quantity which is independent of whether it's Hilsa or tuna. It's like if you pick up a random fish irrespective of Hilsa or tuna, what is probability its length is 2 feet. I forget about that for the moment, let's say. So I just, this is constant, so I can ignore this. I have this proportionality. So this product would be called the posteriori probability. Okay. So this a priori probability is without any measurement. Class conditional is Given a fish belongs to some class, what is the probability? Posterior array is product of these two. You can think of it like this. The posterior array is kind of the inverse of the class conditional. Class conditional says, given it is Hilsa, what is the probability its length is 2 feet? And posterior array says, given it's 2 feet, what is the probability its length? It is Hilsa. It's the inverse. So how did I get this inverse? By multiplying by this a priori or prior probability. And this, why this equation is true? Because this is nothing but the Bayes rule of probability. All of you know the Bayes rule of probability. This is nothing but the Bayes rule of probability. The Bayes rule says P of A given B into PB is P of B given A into PA. Is the Bayes rule of probability. Okay. So the Bayes rule of probability says that if you multiply the a priori by the class conditional, you get the posterior. Proportionally, there is some constant factor. Okay. So this posterior kind of takes into account both the a priori as well as the class conditional by simply taking a product among them. And that's what I do. So what I will do is that I'll modify my previous class boundary a little bit. Instead of drawing the distributions of the class conditional, I will draw the posterior distributions. So earlier, given Hilsa, what is the probability its length is L? Now it's the reverse. Given L, what is the probability it is a Hilsa? That's the inverse of that. Okay, which probably makes more sense because this is the question I am asking. I am the cause effect is like this. First I am measuring the length, then I am asking the question it is Hilsa or not. So this direction of conditional probability is better. Okay, and I repeat the same thing. I plot them, I find out the intersection, and that I call as B star, my optimal division boundary. And since it uses the Bayes rule of probability, this is called the Bayes classifier or the Bayes classification rule. And this B star is called the Bayes decision, optimal Bayes decision boundary because it gives you the minimum error possible. It's called the optimum Bayes decision boundary. Okay. So now one more thing you must have be asking is that, okay, so this distribution may be pretty complex. So how do I find the intersection? I have to solve some complicated equation. No, actually there is a much simpler way to apply this B star rule. Because your goal is given a fish and given the length of a fish, I have to say whether it is Hilsa or tuna. Note one thing, to the left of this B star, where I classify it as Hilsa, this blue distribution, the Hilsa distribution, lies above this pink distribution. So in the region of length, where I'll say it is Hilsa, the Hilsa curve is above the tuna curve. And similarly on the right side, where I'll say it is tuna, the tuna curve is above the Hilsa curve. Okay. So given an arbitrary L, say, let's say this is a L given to me, L1 given to me. Okay, so I'll not try to find out this B star and compare L with L1 with B star. I'll not do all that. All I will do is that for this L1, what is the P Hilsa given L1? So what is PH given L1? That I'll find out. Similarly, I find out what is PT given L1. This will find out. I'll just compare these two value. Whichever is higher, I'll put it in that class. Whichever is higher, I'll put it in that class. So basically, for a given value of L, I'll find out which posterior probability is higher, Hilsa or tuna. Whichever is higher, I'll say that this L1, a fish with length L1, belongs to that particular class. Okay. So this rule, this is slightly modified version of the Bayes, or rather same thing, a simplified version of the Bayes rule. Since it takes the higher one, it's called the MAP rule or the maximum a posteriori probability rule. The one which chooses the class with the highest a priori probability. It's called the MAP rule. And this Bayes classifier is also sometimes called a MAP classifier. Maximum a posteriori classifier. Okay. there is another advantage of this. There is another advantage of doing this. That suppose I have so far talked about only two classes. So only one B star, one boundary suffices. But let's say there are three classes. So there is a length distribution of Hilsa, there is a length distribution of tuna, and then there is another class of, let's say, shark. There is a length distribution of shark. So suppose I find a fish of this length. Let me call it as L2. How do you decide which of these three classes belongs to? Same, you apply the maximum map rule. You find probability of shark, you find probability of Hilsa, you find probability of tuna. Whichever is highest, you put it into that class. Put it into that class. So you can generalize it to k classes, any number of classes. All right. So that is the thing. Okay, so one more, all right. So I think up to this is clear. So just to summarize, we will take a sample, construct the class conditional distribution, find out the a priori probability is very easy to find out. We have taken 2000 samples. You count how many are Hilsa, count how many are Hilsa. Just take this ratio. Take this ratio. That's your a priori probability. Okay, very simple to calculate. No need of this complex histogramming, braining, and all these things. Just count. Okay, so you will take the a posteriori probability you calculate by multiplying them. Note that you can ignore the denominator, that constant denominator, because you are taking the maximums, and the denominator is same for all these three curves. So even if we ignore the denominator, the maximum will still remain the maximum. So the rule will not change. So you find out this and apply the map rule. That's it. Now the question is, now there are different ways. So the only thing remaining to, so the only real difficult thing to remaining is to construct this class conditional distribution. I have said one way that you make small bins, plot the y-axis, fit it, and so on. In practice, what people do, they do a parametric analysis. They assume, okay, this distribution is a Gaussian, or this distribution is a Poisson, or something, or a gamma distribution. They assume some parametric form of this distribution's class conditional. And then they estimate the parameters of the distribution, a mean and variance per Gaussian, and so on. From the data, they estimate that. And then apply this map rule and other. So that's the parametric approach. And because one thing, for one dimension, this binning is fine. If we increase the number of dimension, maybe two, maybe you measure not just the length of the fish, you measure its weight, its color, everything. So then this binning becomes computationally difficult. So you assume it's a Gaussian, you make a parametric assumption, it's a Gaussian or something, and estimate the parameters of the Gaussian. And then once you know, so then you know the distribution exactly and follow the rest of the steps. Okay, but one thing that it is Gaussian or Poisson, it is after all an assumption. You are assuming that the data behaves like this. In practice, data may not behave like this. So the assumption may be wrong, it may give you bad results. So there is one general way, rather called a non-parametric way of solving this. The idea is like this. So suppose I have a length, let's say 1.2 feet. I have a fish of certain length. Okay, I don't bother about what this distribution is and all this. What I do is that I look at all the fish in my sample which has length from, let's say, 1.2, so from 1.1 to 1.3. I totally find out, and 1.2 is my target. So I take a small window around that, 1.1 to 1.3, and find how many fish has length in this range. Say I find 65 fish, 65 samples whose length is between 1.1 and 1.3. I look at this 65. And out of this 65, I check how many are tuna and how many are Hilsa. That number will be proportional to these heights. That number it will take both a priori and class condition. It will be proportional to this height, that number. So the map rule in that case is equivalent to putting it in the class among these 65, let's say out of 65, say 60 are Hilsa, 60 are Hilsa, and say 5 are Tuna, 5 are Tuna. Okay, so that will actually be close to this proportion of the sites, close to this proportion of the sites. Okay, so map rule will tell us that, okay, if H is 60, you choose H. Map rule, according to map rule, that will be what will be decided. Okay, so this you can, so only thing you need to do, instead of all this complicated Gaussian assumption and all this kind of thing, all you do is that if you have to classify length of fish 1.2, you take all the fish in the length range 1.1 to 1.3, and among them see which class is the majority. Among them say which class is higher in number, which class in hierarchy. 2 class it is fine, in 3 class you see which class is majority. So let's say in these cases out of 65, say 60 is Tuna and 3 is Hilsa and maybe just 2 is Shark. You take the majority class and put it in that class. Put it in that class. Only thing you have to do, you have to choose a small window around L2. If you took too large a window, it will not give a good result. This forms the basis of something called a K nearest neighbor rule, which generalizes this to higher dimension, this principle to higher dimension. Okay, so what we say is that this window around 1.2, this all these 65 fish which falls in this window range, we call them as the neighbors of this 1.2 length fish. We call them as neighbors because they lie close together. Their lengths are similar. We call them as neighbors. And we take a majority vote among the classes among the neighbors. Whichever is the majority, you predict it as that. You can easily generalize it to higher dimension. Let's say this dimension, this has 2 dimensions. Let's say this is length of a fish and this is weight of a fish. So every fish is a point in this 2 dimension. It has a particular length and a weight value. So 2 coordinates, every fish is a point. Let's say all the Tuna fish are this plus point and all the Hilsa fish are this minus point. Hilsa fish are this minus point. So all I will do is that I will, for a new point, new fish whose length and weight is this x, so some length, some weight is this x, I find out the closest neighbor. I call it the one nearest neighbor. Since it is minus, I'll classify this as minus. Similarly here, I take 2 neighbors. I take 2 neighbors. Okay, one of them is plus, one of this minus, so ambiguous, I cannot take a decision. Take 3 neighbors. Three closest neighbors, 3 closest point among all these plus and minus point. Take 3 closest point. Okay, so among these 3 closest point, I find that 2 are plus, 1 is minus. So I will kind of say that it is plus because plus is the majority. Plus is the majority. So this is called the K nearest neighbor rule. So all you need to do is to you have a feature representation, feature space representation. So here 2-dimensional feature space. It generally it may be higher dimensional feature space. All you need to do is given a point, you choose a number k which gives you how many neighbors you want to take. How many neighbors? So it is 3 nearest, k equal to 3, k equal to 2, k equal to 1. You take how many neighbors you are taking. And in order to find out how do you find the neighbors, you take distance of x to each of them. You take the distance of x to each of them. And pick up the k points which have the closest distance. Pick up k which have closest distance. Where k is 1, 2, or 3. Usually k is chosen to be an odd number to make tries. Okay, so so you choose a distance function to find out, choose a value of k, choose k nearest neighbor, and take the majority class among them. Take the majority class among them. And whichever is the majority class, classify the point as belonging to that class. So this is the rule. Find the k nearest neighbor, count the class membership among the neighbors, take the majority class, put it among that. Two things you need to choose while designing your k nearest neighbor classifier. First is what is the value of k. If you choose k to be too small, it will be sensitive to noise. If you choose k to be very large, it will oversmooth, it will cover the all set of data. So this is an open problem in machine learning. What is the right choice of k? This is an open problem. Second is you have to choose a distance function. How do you compute the distance? So this is again problem dependent. Say in biology, say for example, so this is a set of, let me just quickly go through this. So how do you choose k? That is a problem. There is one thumb rule that if you have total n number of training points, you can choose k to be square root of n. You can choose k to be square root of n. That's a kind of thumb rule, no theoretical basis. It works in practice. Second is what is the distance function you will take. You can take Euclidean distance, you can take Minkowski, you can take Manhattan, you can take many other, Mahalanobis, you can take many distances. Okay, which one work? Because actually many time in biology, people have devised their own distance. So if you have two proteins, maybe the distance between two proteins is how much do you need to modulate one protein or morph one protein into making another protein, or how many positions they differ. So anything depending on your problem statement, you define a distance. Just define a distance. Okay, and then you apply the k nearest neighbor rule. So this gives you the advantage because many of the Bayes rule, which is a probabilistic rule, it is a distribution. So you have to have a nice metric real valued thing or a discrete valued thing. But here it can be anything. It can be a three-dimensional structure. It can be a sequence, anything. Just some way of measuring the distance. That will help you to solve this k nearest neighbor. Okay, so there are many more. I'm just quickly, I don't have time, so I'm quickly skimming through the other algorithm. So this is a decision tree. What this does is that it's a build a tree structure like this. It looks at one of the features. Say first it will look at length, then it will look at width. This is typically when a doctor diagnoses a patient. She will look at one parameter, then if yes, she will look at another parameter, then yes. Finally, in the leaf of this tree, you will come to a decision when all your testings end. There are different ways of building this tree. I'm not going through them. And this is the construction rule. Basically, you try to get the tree which maximally separates two classes of thing. Okay, I'll quickly maybe go through one clustering algorithm. So the goal here is to group points into clusters. So here I have three clusters so that the distance between the points belonging to the same cluster, that is the intra-cluster distance, is small, whereas distance between the points across two clusters, which we call the inter-cluster distance, is large. So you can take their ratio, sometimes called the scatter, interplot to intercluster to intercluster. Okay, so you can take this. So with this, so clustering means you are given a set of points, you basically color them. You put a color and say all points with a particular color are in the same group. I have used three colors here. And I have to color the points in such a way such that these two criteria is satisfied. This criteria and this criteria is satisfied. So accordingly I have to color. So in mathematical term, this is called a partitioning of the points. I have to partition accordingly. There are many clustering algorithms, partitional, hierarchical. I will quickly describe a k-means clustering algorithm. Let me see what, okay, let me explain with this, what will happen. So these are the set of points. Say I have to group them into three groups, k equal to three groups. So k is the number of groups, k equal to three groups. So I do it in the following way. So what I do, I randomly pick up 3 points or k points if there are k number of clusters. I randomly pick up k points. In this diagram, I denoted k by these crosses, these crosshairs, these plus symbols. Okay, this is 1 point, this is 1 point, this is 1 point. And for the remaining point, I see all the points which are closest to this plus, one of these 3 points, I label them as green. And all the points which are closest means closest, so all these blue points are closer to this plus as compared to this two other class. All these green points are closer to this plus as compared to other class. Similarly, all these brown points are closer to this plus as opposed to these two other plus. Okay, so basically all the green points are closer to this plus, all the blue points are closer to this plus, and all the brown points are closer to this plus. And these pluses were randomly chosen initially. Okay, so this is iteration 1. Iteration 1, 2, what I do, I change the position of these pluses. How I change? The new position of this green plus is the mean or the centroid of all these green points. This plus is the centroid of all these green points. So this plus now lies here, which is the centroid of these green points. Similarly, the blue plus is now at the centroid of all the blue points here. So maybe somewhere here. Similarly, the brown plus is in the centroid of this brown. Okay. Now erase this coloring, erase all these colors. Now among the point, see whichever of these points, all these points, not just green points, green, blue, brown, all points combined, among them, all the points which are closer to this plus as opposed to these two other plus, now relabel them as green. Relabel them as green. And all the points which are closer to this plus, you relabel them as blue, and this as brown. Now you see the coloring, the labeling now changes over iteration because the position of these pluses have changed. Okay. And then this iteration 2, what you want, again move this plus to the centroid of this new set of green points. Move blue and brown. Do this for several times, and after some time, what you will see that these positions of these pluses over successive iteration changing significantly. Very minutely it is changing. Then you say your algorithm has converged, and these colorings that you get are the groups. These are the groups. So all this brown I call one group, green one group, blue one group. That is what I say. That's it. That will give me, that is my final clustering. Okay. So this is one thing. I don't think I have time to go into neural network. So neural network is same as this. Let me come to this picture. Okay. This FX. Now see, I have all these. I have seen a line. I have seen a boundary in Bayesian classifier. I have seen k nearest neighbor, which is non-parametric. Can I? So suppose I have an arbitrarily complex. So now see one more thing. Suppose these are the classes. These are the classes. If it is a classification problem, you kind of use, you remember, you draw a class boundary and say all points on this side in one class, all points in this side in the other class. So if we have an arbitrarily complex, very complex nonlinear class boundary, which is true in many cases, how do I do? Do we have a general class of function? Linear will not work, quadratic will not work, cubic will not work. So we have a general class of function where it will work, something universal. It's like spline fitting or something which is universal. And the answer is neural networks. The answer is neural networks. These are, I don't have time to go into detail. So this is a general structure like this. You have neurons and there is interconnection between them. So this is the function. This is the function fx. And you see for neural networks, if you keep on increasing the number, these are called layers and these are called nodes and these are called edges or weights. If you keep on increasing them, whatever complex function you have, fx you have, you can realize. These are universal approximators. You can realize them. Okay, and there is a nice optimization algorithm which called the backpropagation algorithm or the gradient descent algorithm, which gives you the best set of weights. The parameters here are these weights of these edges, which gives you the minimum error, and that it will give you the optimal network. So that's the backpropagation rule. I don't have time to go through that, but these are universal approximators, especially if you increase the number of layers and into what is called increase the number of layers, which is again someone motivated by brain structure. Brain have several layers: higher brain, low level neuron, mid level neuron, sensory neurons, and finally you come to the division. You have multiple layers, just like a neural network. You call it a deep neural network or a deep learning algorithm. And they are kind of universal. They can be used to solve many complex problems. For example, image recognition, you have a convolutional neural network, which has several. So you want to recognize this character. There are several such layers, pooling layer, convolution layer, and you get the output. So these are almost universal approximators. Okay. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through this. I'll share the slides. And maybe I can. I mean, there are a lot of videos available. Maybe sometime later I can talk. I'm not going into this because I'm out of time. Okay, so all these techniques we talked about has innumerous applications in computational biology. Either say motif discovery, we are working on some problem, gene network discovery, epigenomics, disease circuits, metabolic circuits, phenotype prediction. Mediation or intervention analysis, single cell analysis, medical record analysis, many applications in computational biology, you can use them. All of them, the good thing is that all of them can be, that is your job. Given a problem, you have to pose it either as a clustering problem or classification problem or regression problem. Then you have to choose whether you will use a neural network or a Bayes classifier or a nearest neighbor. Nearest neighbor Bayes classifier is simpler. Deep learning is more complex, computationally more challenging. You need supercomputers and other. Okay, so you have to choose that. Here are some small examples like a pipeline. So this is, for example, a protein structure functional analysis. So you see this slide I'm showing, because see, machine learning is often embedded in the overall computational biology pipeline. So for example, you are doing some experiments. You are doing a crystal structure X-ray, and then you are doing a molecular dynamics simulation, which is a HPC. Then you are learning a probabilistic machine learning model, something like a Bayesian model. And then so this fits into this fits into this, and finally you have a prediction which you biologically validate into a function prediction. Okay, so typically it is built in. I don't want you to write machine learning programs from scratch. There are many libraries, Python libraries, many libraries. There is a nice visual interface like Weka, W-E-K-A. I'll write down the name, which is very useful for beginners. Weka machine learning library. You can download it. It is free. You just download it. It is very easy to install also. You just click on it, it will get installed. And all these algorithms, decision tree, neural network, deep learning, support vector machine, Bayesian, they are implemented. You have just to upload your data set, choose the algorithm, not even upload, it is a desktop application. You choose the algorithm, it will give you the result, full analysis of the result. So that is possible. Many tertiary structure prediction, many of the things you can do. So your job as computational biologist would be to frame the problem properly. What is the input representation? What is X? What is Y? What should be Y? Okay, what is that you want? What is the error function? What is the distance function? All these, as from a computational biology domain knowledge point of view, if you design, if you settle, then there are ready-made machine learning algorithms, Weka or any tool, scikit-learn, PyTorch, any tools are there. Those are very easy to use. You just prepare your data. Okay, another thing you have to do is to prepare the data, prepare the representation, fit them into them, they'll give you the result. The purpose of today's talk is to somewhat give you an idea about what this machine learning, what is happening inside. But actually there are a lot of tools you can do without understanding them also. Microarray analysis, personalized medicine. So many places, some patients from some hospital in USA. So you are doing feature selection, which features to choose, which drugs to choose, prior knowledge, all this you can do. Okay, I don't have time to speak about this. Phenotype prediction, many things. Actually, another thing I'll tell you, often these pipelines, HPC and the AI, they are mixed. And experiments, HPC, biological analysis, they are all together in the pipeline. That's what when you get the best results. That's right. Okay, so with this I end. I'm ending just in time. So these are some references. This is a book, Introduction to Statistical Learning, with R programs given. This is a very nice book by Steinbach Kumar. Even though the name is data mining, it talks about machine learning algorithms only. It gives Steinbach, Bipin Kumar, very nice. There are a lot of video lectures, NPTEL lectures. I have some NPTEL lectures in data mining. There are others also, which are freely available in YouTube. Many Stanford University lectures, they are very nice. You can go through them. So this is the textbook. You can, these are freely downloadable from the web. Okay. So with this I end. If there are any questions, I can answer. Maybe I'll stop the presentation so that you can see what people are asking. Yeah, please, if anybody has any question, I'll be happy to answer. You may please. Yeah, Sonam Kumar, can you please unmute and speak?
Yeah, thanks, Professor, for the amazing talk. So my question is specific to the multi-class classifier that you were talking about. So the posterior distributions that you had shown, so is there any possibility that the distributions would overlap with each other?
Yeah,
like
most of the time they'll overlap.
Okay, so if the overlap is like not as clear as it's shown on this particular graph that you have shown, so how do we go ahead if so the vertical line that you have drawn, it might, here it is very clear that one of them is very low, another one is very high. So I'll choose the class corresponding to the distribution which is plotted on the higher side. So the distance between these two is quite high. So if the distance is like less, then how do we choose the class? For example, the vertical line is little towards the right, not at the point of intersection exactly. So won't there be a little error which might come into place over there?
Excellent question. In fact, I have not covered this. So this is called uncertainty analysis. See, one of the reason that Bayes classifier is good, not only it gives you a class decision, it gives you an output class, it also gives you the confidence in your decision. How confident you are. So if this ratio of this height is very high, then you are very confident it is Hilsa. If it is closer, if it is the difference is not so much, then your confidence goes down. So instead of, you can call it confidence, you can also call it uncertainty. Like I'll give you a regression example that will make things clear. Okay, so let's say there are some regression points like this and something like this. Okay, so usually I have a regression line. A normal thing, least square regression will give me a regression line. But if it is a Bayesian regression, not only you will give a regression line, but we will say that it will give you a uncertainty region envelope along this regression line. Okay, what it will say, the regression line is this, but it can be anything. With the highest probability, it is this red one, but there are also sufficient probability of this being this or this or this. That is sufficient. So this is a band of uncertainty along this. So basically, if you look at its length versus weight problem, you'll say a person of this length is expectedly having this weight, but there is a probability of this weight, this weight, this weight also. There's an uncertainty. This much is the uncertainty. And okay, you may have a low uncertainty, You may have a high uncertainty in some region, low uncertainty in some region. If we extend it to classification, let's say, so let me do one thing. Let me kind of plot the uncertainty. So maybe I should not plot it in this, but let me plot. So in this region, the uncertainty of your decision is very low, but in this region, the uncertainty picks up. Then you have a very high. Here, absolutely, it is ambiguous. When they intersect, you cannot really decide it is this class or this class. You basically arbitrary. You just randomly take any class. You cannot. They are equally likely. Both are equiprobable. Equiprobably, it's 2 Naur hills. You really can't take any decision. Just take something. Arbitrarily, you take something. So the closer you move to the class boundary, your uncertainty goes up, and further you're away from it, your uncertainty goes down, and confidence will be reverse of this. Confidence will be reverse of this. So this is like humans also. Humans, some decisions we are confident in our decision. Whenever there is a confusion, they are near the boundary, your confidence in your decision goes down. So that is what this analysis is. That is one of the main advantage of Bayes classification. Not only it gives you a class decision, it also helps you quantify the uncertainty in your decision, the confidence in your decision. So now how you use this confidence, that's another matter. You must have heard on this astrophysics or this particle physics, even in biology, when people say, okay, we have observed this, but with this much confidence. This is this Higgs boson has been found, but with 0.95 confidence. Or you in biology, you can say, okay, this motif is this, but with this much confidence. So that is what this Bayes classifier will help you to do. That is the idea.
Sure. Thank you so much.
There is a very big, I can share you. If you send me an email, my email is pavitra@gmail. If you send me an email, there is a big literature on how to do this uncertainty analysis, how to find out this confidence and so on. There are a lot of ways. Okay.
Sure, Professor. I'll write to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So next question, Sutanu, can you please unmute?
Thank you, sir. It is very nice presentation. My question is that there are a lot of machine learning classifier algorithm is available. So which algorithm should we try first? Because how we'll understand, because based on data it will depend. So
yes,
it's very difficult, lot of algorithm to try and it will not rational, then compare things. So how we should start to apply this algorithm?
Exactly. So this is a kind of an open question. I cannot give you 100% correct answer to this question, but what I can say is that if you feel that your problem is relatively simple or high dimension, see, there are two things. One thing is how much data you have. If you have small amount of data, you definitely go by the traditional classifiers like Bayes classifier, K nearest neighbor, decision tree, random forest, support vector machine. If you have large number of samples, only then you can go for a neural network or a deep learning algorithm. And also, many problems do not require a deep learning. You can do it with simple support vector machine, K nearest neighbor, Bayes classifier only. So the thumb rule is, unless you know that your problem is very difficult, if you are not sure, start with the simple algorithms. Start with nearest neighbor. Always start with nearest neighbor. Then go for decision tree. Then go for support vector machine. Then go for neural network. Okay. There is a rule called the Occam's razor principle. The rule is that the rule is like this: you make your tool as complex as required to solve your problem, but not further. That means if you need let's say you need a hammer to drive a nail in the wall, you have only keep a simple hammer. Don't unnecessarily make a hammer also be a screwdriver and also be if your job is only to put a nail, you don't unnecessarily take a very complicated machine. Take a simple machine and try to solve it. I am saying it as a philosophical principle. So always the simplest algorithm that solves your problem, you should choose that algorithm. I am telling it as a philosophical problem, but this can be mathematically proved. It's called the minimum description length principle. It says that from the point of view of generalization capability, the simpler classifiers are always better than the complex classifiers. But a simpler classifier may not solve your problem. You may need a complex classifier. But if a simpler classifier solves your problem, always choose a simpler classifier. That's the rule.
Okay. Thank you.
So this is somewhat against what this HPC and supercomputing we are talking about. But again, even if you are a user of supercomputing, you should use a supercomputer only when it is necessary to use a supercomputer. Unnecessarily, you should not use it. If it does not require, you should not use it. You use a simpler problem.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Okay. Any other question? Otherwise, we can move to the next talk.
Hello.
Okay. So I think, thank you everybody. You can always email me for the any clarification or further information. So
Excuse me, sir. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, sir. Sir, I'm Jiten. So as a participant, so here, so only this course, this topic is purely artificial intelligence and its application to biology. So how your SPC is used here? So role of SPC.
Okay.
In
So I'll answer your question this way. See, in my talk, I admit that I have not talked about any computational biology or HPC application. I have, we have structured the workshop into, in the first half, we'll have basic introductory talks on HPC and AI. And in the second half, we'll have computational biology applications. So my talk, because of the limitation of time, I could have spoken about a lot of computational biology, but I thought that if I explain the basics of this machine learning, it will help you in computational biology application. That's why I gave this talk. So I'm sorry if I have, I should have done otherwise. But in the other talks in the workshop, like the next talk or other talk, there will be a lot, like yesterday's microbiome. This was basically an application of clustering algorithm to the microbiome thing. So the K-means clustering algorithm. So you have to wait for the other talks for the computational biology part. I get your question, but I have no answer to it. Okay. So if there are no other question, is there any other question? Thank you. We'll now move to.
Excuse me, sir.